Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight I'm going to do a video on a little bit of a different topic. And this is kind of a branch off of my last two videos, but really all three of these videos were kind of inspired by watching a video by a YouTuber called Crimson Rogue. I'll link to his channel down below, as well as to the particular video I was watching. He was doing a book review. That's his thing. He does book reviews and studies how they're adapted into movies. Pretty good channel, worth checking out. But he was reviewing a book that hasn't actually been turned into a movie, called, I believe that he said the title was "This Is Why I Hate You" by another YouTuber, goes by the handle of Onision. It was really just an hour-long rip fest on what sounds like a pretty bad piece of writing. I haven't actually read it, so I can't really say for sure how good or bad it was, but you can watch the review, and if you want to dive into it, you can try reading it for yourself if you're really interested. It doesn't sound that interesting to me, so I'm probably never going to get around to it, but there you have it. Anyway, what came up in Crimson's video was the subject of rape as a plot point or as a part of your story, however you want to look at it. And there are a lot of people who just say, you shouldn't really use rape as a plot point in a story. There's just no reason to do it. You hear that a lot. And the people who say that, I think they're coming from by and large, a good place. They know that people who have survived rape or other more severe forms of sexual assault, which is to say they are more severe than just maybe being kissed by surprise or, being felt up once, as opposed to being more severe than rape. Because there is a spectrum of sexual assault, just as there is a lot of things. The point is, a lot of times when people have been a victim of those kinds of violations, those kinds of offenses, there is a stereotype that they don't want to see them in media. And I say a stereotype because I have heard a number of people who have been the victims of rape or other forms of severe sexual assault say they either don't mind seeing them or they actively reject the notion that they should be shielded from seeing that kind of thing in media because they feel it robs them of agency. There's a whole debate to be had there, and I've never been a victim of any kind of sexual assault. So I really can't speak to it from that side of the equation. But I, as a writer and as a creator, I find that notion to be, while understandable, I find it to be ultimately insubstantial. I don't find it to be a credible standard that any writer or storyteller in general can hold themselves to. And I'm going to talk about why. First of all, I do want to say that I understand, again, why other people would feel the way they do about it. And this is why I made the other two videos. I think it's a mix of a fear response and a disgust response. They're frightened by the memories or the ideas that stories that contain rape can bring up, and I can respect that. I understand why that would be the case, but as I said in my video on fear and creativity, as a creator, I cannot let the things my audience is afraid of hold me back from exploring the issues that I feel need to be explored in stories I tell. Now, how well those issues are explored is another thing entirely. And, going back to Crimson's video, which inspired this, um, he suggests that you know that Onision, or Greg, if you prefer, did a terrible job of exploring the subject of rape in his story. I have no doubt that was the case. Most people who try and tackle it do. Um, just because a subject shouldn't be off limits doesn't mean an author is going to do well with it. Doesn't mean they're going to do it justice. Doesn't mean they are going to. Well, I mean, the more difficult a subject is, the more skilled you have to be to tackle it as a storyteller, and most people are going to fail when it comes to a subject as touchy as rape. And maybe they should have reflected a little more before tackling that subject. Maybe they were in fact using it for cheap emotional impact. And you know what? That happens. It's unfortunate, but the notion that people should just avoid it because some people use it for cheap emotional impact because some people handle it badly is just dumb. It's an emotional response, in some cases a justified emotional response, but I don't think anyone who really wants to be a writer, who wants to be a storyteller, can allow that emotional response from the audience to dictate what they do. Not every story is for everyone, and part of being adults and engaging with story, engaging with media in a responsible way is accepting that there are stories that are going to offend you, are going to frighten you, are going to disgust you, and knowing when to step back and allow those stories to exist, whether good or bad, and just say, okay, well, that wasn't for me. And maybe sometimes you can even say that writer didn't know what they were doing, or they handled that in a really offensive way, and you can suggest ways to do it better. But I don't think you can ever say no, that topic is completely off the table. That should not be tackled in a story at all. I just self-censorship is still censorship, and I do think there are times for that. When you say, I don't have what it takes to tackle this story and to tell it rightly and properly, when you know your limits as a craftsman, that is the time to back away from a project. Backing away from a project because some part of your audience might be offended, that is real censorship. That's censorship of the self. And I would much rather have 1,000 stories where rape is mishandled, where it's handled poorly, where it's treated as a plot convenience, than have an artistic scene where self-censorship is the norm. I just don't think that's responsible storytelling. Even though it probably does come from a good place, from wanting people to be able to engage with your stories, from wanting people to not have the worst parts of their past dredged up and haunt them. I think it's better to preserve the integrity of our creative ecology, our creative environment, than to allow self-censorship to become the norm. And it would be my hope, if I were to ever write a story that could cause those kinds of fears or those kinds of disgust in a victim of rape or a similar case of sexual assault, it would be my hope that one day, when they have healed from that trauma and that emotional impact, that they will be able to engage with the story I create as it was intended, as opposed to through the lens of their trauma. And that I think if I were to try and tackle that subject in a story I told, that would be the way I would try and approach it, so that not for people who are still struggling with that trauma, but hopefully for the people who have overcome that trauma to be able to see that story and engage with that story and enjoy that story in spite of their trauma. Now, Crimson brought up a comment left by another person that I want to address. So this was not Crimson's thought, although I think he did agree with it to some extent. And that thought was that it was odd that stories that deal with rape and sexual assault almost always do so from the point of view of someone who knew the victim, as opposed to the point of view of someone who was a victim of rape or sexual assault. And I think that's true, and I think that's true for a very simple reason. Very few people in the nation or in the world really have been sexually assaulted or raped. And I know that a lot of people are probably thinking of a stat they may have heard while they were in college, or perhaps simply getting ready for college, or had a friend who was going to college, or something to that effect. Probably heard the stat that 1 in 5 women are raped at college. That is, or at least sexually assaulted at college. That stat is probably not accurate. It's very hard to say with certainty, but there's a lot of really bad methods that went into gathering that stat. I'll link to a video by Professor Christina Hoff Summers down below that will kind of explain that a little bit more, certainly better than I could. Suffice it to say, based on actual reported crime statistics, the actual rate is probably about 1 in 80, which is, a high number, I guess. 1 in 80 women being assaulted, that's not great. And that's not a thing we want. But it's still a small portion of the overall populace. 1 in 80, that's what, 2 or 3% of the total population. And that's just women. The rate among men is probably lower. So if you throw them in, men can get raped too. It probably drops. Maybe 1.5% of the total population is going to approach your story from the point of view of a person who has been assaulted. On the other hand, most people have a circle of friends that is larger than 80 people. So the odds that they're going to know someone who has been assaulted, much higher. I have never been sexually assaulted, but I do know, I did know in high school a girl who was raped. And it's very possible that, there are other people who have been raped or sexually assaulted that I have met since then. I just, never knew that. But the odds that, your general audience is going to be able to understand and empathize with or resonate with the experience of a person who knows someone who's been the victim of a rape or sexual assault is much higher than just how likely it is that someone themselves will have been a victim of a rape or sexual assault. And so while it's totally valid to tell a story from the point of view of a victim, um, of rape or sexual assault, and those stories should be told, um, it's not going to resonate with as wide an audience. And the people who are going to be equipped to tell that story are going to be few and far between. I mean, it's already, as I said, it's already a very difficult topic to tackle. Um, you throw in how few people are going to be familiar with that side of it. Um, the perspective of a victim, and it gets even harder to really meaningfully, accurately engage with that story. Um, at the same time, I think that there are parts of the human experience um, that you can only really look at through that lens of sexual assault. There are, you know, creates probably one of the most strong, most visceral reactions of anything in human society. Almost many of the um, major lynchings in history were the result of supposed sexual assaults. The response that comes to that is very different, I think, than to anything else. Just look at some of our earliest history or stories from history, depending on how you choose to look at them. In the book of Genesis, we see that when Jacob's daughter is raped, two of his sons conspire to trick the people responsible, and not just the people responsible, but all of the people in the community, and they murder them, like straight up. They kill everyone involved, and probably a lot of people who weren't involved. It was conceivably a horribly disproportionate response. We see this again in the book of Judges, and we see it outside, the Bible. Look at the Iliad. The Iliad is at its core a story about people who are so incensed by the kidnapping and rape, because when you mind control a woman to accept your sexual advances, it's a rape. They understood that even back then. This was, people were so incensed by this, they fought a 10-year war. They raised armies. They leveled a city over it. I mean, sure, that's a story, but it's a story about how visceral a reaction people have to these notions of sexual assault, of rape, and even in the most brutal revenge tale, it never really seems to hit the same level of viciousness in the response to it. So I think there is something to be said about human nature, and stories about how we respond to rape. It is truly something that we seem to respond to differently from any other crime. So, again, to get back to my initial point, I think that this notion that rape and sexual assault are not good subjects for stories comes from a very straightforward, understandable place. It comes from people who are used to, who want to have everyone they can engage with media and enjoy it. And they see this subject handled so badly, so frequently, that they just want to say, no, let's not do that anymore. But I think the reality is, creatively, we can't do that. And if we want to really dig into the human experience, we can't do that. So, yeah, if you want to be, if you want to be a storyteller, you cannot just let a knee-jerk emotional reaction from you or from your audience dictate what you will tell stories about. Rather, let what you tell stories about be dictated by careful examination of what it means to be a human being, of what events do to human beings, and then tell your stories from that perspective. And hopefully, people who are in a place emotionally, mentally, spiritually, where they can engage with that part of the human experience, will find your stories and enjoy them. And hopefully, the people who are not emotionally steady enough to deal with what the parts of the human experience you're looking at will recognize that and step back, because I think that's part of responsible media consumption. Just as, doing everything you can to tackle a subject well is part of responsible storytelling. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about, what I've been hoping to get into as I made my past few videos. My next video, we're going to talk about something a little bit lighter. We're going to be looking at Narwhal's Earthbound, and I have a few things to say about that, so look forward to it. If you enjoyed what you heard today, well, there's a like button and a subscribe button down below. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.